This week we saw footballer Marcus Rashford lock horns with MPs over his continued campaign for free school meals over the holidays. We also heard how a number of senior clergy, including the Archbishops of Canterbury and York, wrote an open letter criticising the government's new internal market bill for setting a disastrous precedent.
In response to that letter, MP Steve Baker, the former Brexit minister, reportedly said the archbishops had inadvertently sown division where they might have promoted unity and suggested they should stay out of politics.
So in today's world, should the church have a powerful voice in politics when people like celebrities seem to have more public support?
We're asking, should religion stay out of politics? Here to discuss those issues are Anglican priest and lecturer Reverend Dr Anderson Jeremiah, hello, Professor of Religion and Society at Lancaster University, Linda Woodhead, Rabbi of Maidenhead Synagogue, Dr Jonathan Romain, and President of Humanists UK, Professor Alice Roberts.
Welcome to you all. Rabbi Jonathan, according to the British Social Attitude Survey, 52% of UK adults are non-religious. Does the Church of England and religion still have a role to play in politics?
Oh, definitely. I mean, if you've got this sort of moral commandments about doing justice and protecting the vulnerable and the dignity of every person, that can't be limited to sort of, I don't know, church fates or sort of flower arranging classes. It's got to be out there in the wider sphere. And the Bible, you know, that was the role of religion in earlier times. And your prophets, your Amos and Isaiah, were always protesting against political corruption or business malpractices or neglect of human rights. The only limit I would put on this is that I think clergy can speak out about political issues, such as, I know, homelessness or food banks or arms trade, but not party politics. In other words, we shouldn't sort of push a particular manifesto from the pulpit. Now, I'm not saying that religion can speak more than anybody else. We're not privileged, but nor should we be gagged either. And frankly, if a minister isn't prepared to talk about values outside of the church or synagogue walls, then he shouldn't be in the pulpit in the first place.
So, Alice, the National Churches Trust study that was published last week suggested that church services and buildings, it doesn't just mean religious services, you know, youth clubs and things like that, contribute about 12.4 billion worth of essential social and economic support to local communities. Do you not think there's any way in which the church can bring greater understanding, because it's so rooted in the community, to a political discussion?
I think the fact that the church contributes economically can't be an argument for it having greater political influence. That's a slippery slope. And if we were to say that, then that means that any big business, religious business or not, should have more influence in politics. And I think that it's absolutely fine and right for the church to express an opinion on something like food banks that it's involved with, and even actually the intention of the government to break international law, because that's a very general moral issue. But it goes much further than that. The Archbishop's letter is actually commenting on issues of trade and devolution. And of course, you know, the previous speaker said that the religious voice doesn't have privilege. Of course it has privilege. We have 26 automatic places in the House of Lords reserved for Church of England bishops. No other religious group, and no other groups at all, get that ring-fenced allocation in the House of Lords. And there are only 2 countries in the world where there are religious clerics with automatic seats in a parliament, and that is Iran and the UK. This is really, really anachronistic. It's positively medieval. We're a pluralistic society. Why does one religion have that political privilege in the UK?
Anderson, this is a multicultural, multi-faith country. It's a bit outdated, isn't it, that religion or church has a special status and an influence within the political sphere?
Well, as a post-colonial scholar, I would be the first one to say that that shouldn't be the case. But, you know, we have heard the case for disestablishment in the past, and to summarize in the word of previous Archbishop of Rowan Williams, he said it would lead to constitutional unscrambling. But for all reasons and purposes, we are a secular state, but with a strong Christian cultural ethos, with an active secular, multi-faith and multicultural society. However, the church is present in every single community across the country. So the special status is not simply a privilege, rather a moral responsibility to represent all faith communities and none in the political sphere. The reform of our political institutions is essential. Until then, the church functions as a symbolic space which kind of brings all other different faith communities to share and to offer a constructive
sorry to
space.
interrupt. Linda, Anderson has a point, doesn't he? We don't actually have a department for ethics. We don't have a government department for ethics. Could this be the role of the church, or should this be the role of the church in Parliament?
Well, it might be nice, but that's not the role they've been playing. Unfortunately, they're not moral leaders. They're moral laggards, if you like. They've been behind society on so many issues, on the equality of women, on allowing divorced people to get remarried. And just a terrible example this month, the report of the inquiry on child sexual abuse has shown appalling cover-ups, even a couple of bishops themselves being serial abusers and many others turning a blind eye. So the idea that they're giving a moral lead, I think, is now just false. And sadly, I'm an Anglican and used to be in favour of establishment, but I think it's an entitlement that they haven't earned anymore. They've lost that privilege. And in fact, I think it's perhaps corrupted them holding this power.
Rabbi Jonathan, I mean, that's quite damning, isn't it, from Linda? Not moral leaders, they're moral laggers. And then you throw into the mix that religious attendances are down. When religious leaders get involved in politics, are they more unhelpful than helpful?
Well, I agree with much that Alice and Linda say in other areas, but unfortunately I have to differ with both of them in this particular respect, because I think, for, Linda, you're lumping together different groups. I mean, certainly there are some very ultra-Orthodox groups on all faiths, which are moral laggards, but there are other religious groups, the Reform or the Liberals, for instance, who have been at the forefront of anti-slavery or gay rights. And as for the bishops being sort of privileged in the House of Lords, well, 26 bishops may sound a lot, but actually it's only 3% of the total number of people sitting there. And the number of people attending church, synagogue, mosque every weekend is much more than that. Now, I agree that we can do some tweaks here and there, and that, for instance, some of those bishops, maybe we can only have 15, and we can have some rabbis and imams in the Lords instead, and certainly the next coronation, whenever that is, should have multi-faith representation. But it's actually quite good having the church as an established faith, partly because it reflects the history and culture of this country, although we're now multi-faith and multi-religious, partly because it's actually quite useful having some moral backbone to the country. And of course, you can be ethical without being religious, but it does help. And also, to be honest, the Church of England has had a light touch. It's really encouraged other faiths. It's been in the forefront of mixed faith dialogue. And actually, it's also stood up to government. Hasn't been in cahoots. I mean, think of it criticising it over Brexit or over food banks, or even the Archbishop of Canterbury taking Margaret Thatcher to task for going to war over the Falklands. So very often, it's actually been a moral barometer.
Alice, sorry, thank you so much. Alice, so how would you propose ethical leadership? I mean, it seems to me that we have a sort of slightly miserable utilitarian political structure. What for the humanists? How would the humanists propose that we have ethical leadership in Parliament?
I think that what's important in a democracy is equality, and I don't think it's very difficult to argue that we shouldn't have equality, and it's very difficult to argue that those 26 seats should be reserved for one particular religion amongst many, and then that's disregarding the more than half of the population that is not religious. And of course those of us that are not religious have moral and ethical bases to our philosophies. I mean, I think this argument, which has already been deconstructed, that the church is a moral leader, it just doesn't stand up. And I think if you look at history, if you are using that kind of historical argument and saying, well, historically the Church of England has been important, if you also look at history, you see a trend over the last 5 or 6 centuries in Europe. You see a trend towards a movement of power from monarchy to parliament, and a movement of power away from religion as well to parliament. So the separation of church and state, which has happened is written into other countries' constitutions and just hasn't happened in England. And of course, Wales is way ahead of us. It disestablished its church more than 100 years ago. So I think the disestablishment of the church is something that will happen in this half of the 21st century.
All right.
It's just when it happens.
Let's bring in Anderson on that. Well, actually, we've had a few people getting in touch, and I've got a few comments to read out. But if you think about this week, we've had Marcus Rashford taking the lead on school meals. Jagtar on Facebook has told us that he believes this should be a key issue for the church. It sounds exactly like the sort of thing that the church should be getting involved in. Does the fact that it took a footballer to highlight this issue suggest that actually the church is way behind, as Linda said, way behind on these key issues?
Absolutely not, Sean. I think just as you, in this very program, just a moment ago, we saw Pope Francis talking about and instigating a whole new conversation. And you had someone come and speak about it. The church, I think, being politically active and standing up for social justice is the essence. And speaking for the most vulnerable in our midst is the very character of the church. I don't disagree with Professor Linda Woodhead, but the fact is that the church is not claiming to have a moral lead, but rather they have been silently doing excellent work, particularly in the last 7 months. The majority of the food banks are supported by the churches. Institutionally, yes, we are morally corrupt, but at the same time, as a presence in every community, I think the churches have done excellent work, and I'm a trustee of a church.
Linda, thank you, Anderson. Sorry, we're really pressed for time. I'm so sorry to cut you all off. Linda, it seemed to me that Rowan Williams and Justin Welby didn't actually seem that fussed about being disestablished. Do you think it would be the end for the Church of England?
Poor old Church of England has reached the end anyway. There are less than, well, there's about 1% of the population going to church in the Church of England on a Sunday. So in reality, it ceased to be a national church. It's more of a marginal sect now. It's not to say, Anderson's quite right, there is still some wonderful work that goes on in the parishes. But the archbishops are out of touch. They're out of touch on Brexit, where they're against and most Anglicans are in favour. They're out of touch on a whole lot of moral issues. And frankly, I think their silence over the whole coronavirus issue has been appalling. I mean, why haven't they told us about what it means? And
Linda, I'm afraid that is where we're going to have to leave it. Once we get onto coronavirus, we could be talking for hours. So thank you all very much.
Thank you so much for joining us.